The Baroque era was a period of history from around 1600 to 1750. The word Baroque literally means pearl in Portuguese, and it's used to describe the ornate and highly decorative architecture and paintings and frescoes that you see around Europe of the time. The music of the Baroque era follows the same trend, with highly decorated melodies with lots of ornamentation and very complex textures with interweaving melodies. The Baroque era also saw the birth of science and the scientific method as we know them today, with scientists like Francis Bacon, René Descartes and Isaac Newton. Then at the end of the Baroque era, we came into a time known as the Enlightenment period. And this is where people started to advocate ideas like freedom, democracy and reason as primary values for society. And in music, technological advancements saw the creation of new instruments, and instrumental music became much more popular. So what did the music of the Baroque era sound like? Well, the texture was very complex, and they had what's known as counterpoint or contrapuntal texture, also known as polyphonic. And this is where you've got independent melodies interweaving independently from one another, several melodies played at once. Melodies were highly ornamented, lots of ornamentation used. Things like the trill, which is two notes rapidly alternating like this. A mordant, which is just like a short trill, and you've got an upper mordant or a lower mordant. Then you've got grace notes such as the appoggiatura and the acciaccatura. The appoggiatura is like a suspension. Now we'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, you take a note and this note will be part of a chord. The appoggiatura is attached to that note and it takes half of the duration of that note. And the appoggiatura itself will be a non-chord note. So you might have something like a C chord and then a melody. So the appoggiatura was the A there because it's not part of the chord, and then it resolves to a chord note. And then an acciaccatura. This is a crushed note. It's basically where you squeeze another note in. So you might have a melody like this, and then these are all crushed notes, acciaccatura. I've got an example here of a piece from the Baroque era by a composer called Scarlatti. Okay, so hopefully you could hear the different ornaments in that. Other features of Baroque music are the sequence. This is where you have a short melodic phrase that's repeated up or down. So you might have a melody like this. And it's repeated up. Okay, so you hear it's repeated up or maybe down. Okay, so that's a sequence, a rising sequence or a descending sequence. And then we've got pedal notes. So a pedal is a repeated note, usually in the bass line, and it plays while other chords are going on. So we might have a melody like this with a pedal note. Okay, so you heard the C continuing in the left hand while a melody was played with harmony. So An inverted pedal is where you've got the pedal note up in the top of the arrangement. So you might have okay, something like that. And then we mentioned this a little bit earlier, suspensions. A suspension is where you have a note from a previous chord held on to the next chord. And that note then doesn't belong to the new chord, and so it creates a kind of dissonance. And what will then happen is that note needs to be resolved down to a chord note. So here's an example. So just to pick out one of those, the end there, I played an A major chord, but I started with a sus4, so there's a suspended note here. The D doesn't belong to the chord, and then I resolved it down to a C sharp, which is an A major chord. Now there was an idea going around in the Baroque era all about affection. And this is where music, art and literature was used to express emotions, express an affection. And the music of the Baroque era would often just be there to express one affection. So you find pieces in the Baroque era which have one particular mood, perhaps a sad mood or a mood like expressing love or joy. In terms of tonality and harmony, the music up until that point had all been based around church modes, modal music, so things like the Aeolian mode, the Mixolydian mode, things like that. But in the Baroque era, they started to move away from that system towards what we now have today, major and minor. And this is where the music would be based on either a major scale or a minor scale. The chords would be simple diatonic chords. Those are just chords from the notes of the diatonic major or minor scale. And the most common chords in a Baroque piece would be chord 1 of that scale and chord 5 of that scale. And there'd be hardly any chromatic notes or chromatic movement at all, mostly just diatonic chords. That's chords taking notes from the key that we're in. Now, composers and performers were hindered somewhat in expressing themselves through dynamics. This is because of the technology. The instruments at the time weren't as developed as they are now and didn't have the same dynamic range. That's the volume. So they weren't capable of creating loud sounds and very quiet sounds. So what the composers used to do to increase the dynamics, to make a louder sound, they would just add more instruments. So if you had an orchestra and you had a piece that you wanted to start very quiet, then you'd only have 1 or 2 instruments playing. And at a point where you wanted the dynamics loud, then you'd have all the instruments playing. This is called terraced dynamics. And if you imagine terraces, these are kind of platforms, that's how the dynamics would be. It would kind of be this dynamic and then more instruments come in and it would be this dynamic. So that's terraced dynamics. Now by the Baroque era, there were already quite a few established musical structures. Musical structures used in the Baroque era include the concerto. A concerto comes into 2 categories, either the solo concerto or the concerto grosso. The solo concerto is designed for 1 solo instrument accompanied by a whole orchestra. And this is there really to show off that solo instrument, show all the things it can do. The concerto grosso is similar. The only difference is rather than a solo instrument and orchestra, there would be a small group of instruments and then another group, the orchestra. So the small group was called the concertino and the large group, the rest of the orchestra, was called the ripieno. Other forms used in the Baroque era were binary form, which is where you've got section A and then a section B. This would often be repeated, so you'd get A and then B. We also see ternary form pieces. This is where you've got section A, then B, and then back to A again. And another form that we'll come across when we study the Purcell is the ritornello. Now this is where you've got a theme, and then you'll have an episode, and then you'll hear that theme again, and then another episode, and then the theme again. So it's kind of like rondo form, which is A, B, A, C, A, D, and so on. So with ritornello, the A's, those would be the main theme, and then you've got the different contrasting sections in between. Those are the episodes. Now, Baroque instruments, as I've already said, they weren't as advanced as they are today, but they still had lots of different instruments to choose from. One of the most common instruments that we hear in Baroque music is the harpsichord. The harpsichord is a keyboard instrument, and it was extremely versatile, at least compared to other instruments. It was used a lot as a solo instrument, just harpsichord on its own, but it would also be used as part of an orchestra. And ways that it would be used, it would often play a basso continuo. Basso continuo is where you have a continuous bass line that's repeated and chords played in the right hand. And you'd also often have that accompanied by a double bass or cello or a bass instrument playing the bass line as well. Now, when harpsichord music was written, they would often use a thing called figured bass. Now, figured bass is where you'd have, the composer would write a bass line, and then to save them writing out all the chords and exactly how they wanted the chords to be played, they would write numbers underneath the bass line, and that was kind of like a musical shorthand to tell the performer what chords should be played over the top. So then it was up to the performer on the harpsichord to decide how they were going to play those chords using the figured bass. And that's called realizing a figured bass line. And finally, the harpsichord player in an orchestra would often also double as the conductor. So there weren't any conductors in those days. They would actually just sit at the harpsichord, and the other instruments would be around them. So we can see here a picture of a typical Baroque orchestra. We've got the harpsichord right in the middle, and they'd be conducting and keeping everyone in time. And then you've got violins, violas, cellos, and second violins, a double bass, and then a few pieces of woodwind. You've got wooden flutes, bassoon, you might have oboes and recorders as well. There'd be some brass, but not much. We've got natural trumpets in this picture, and what that is, the valve hadn't been invented yet, and the valve is what allows you on a trumpet to shorten or lengthen different pipes in the trumpet, and that allows you to create lots of different pitches. But before that was created, a trumpet would basically just be a length of tube, and that was it. And depending on the length of tube, it would allow you to create different notes. So they'd be much more limited in the number of notes they could play. Before we move on from instruments, it's worth pointing out that the Baroque orchestra would have been much smaller than the orchestras we see today, or even in the classical and romantic period, where the orchestra grew and grew and grew in size. So who was composing in the Baroque era? Well, the composers, most famous ones that I'd recommend would be Henry Purcell, Antonio Vivaldi, Johann Sebastian Bach, and George Frederick Handel. The composer that we're studying in this set work is Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach was a German composer born in 1685, and he died right at the end of the Baroque era in 1750. He spent most of his life employed by the church, writing music for church, for worship. But he also was employed as court composer by various noblemen in the country. His most famous works include the Well-Tempered Clavier, which are a set of 48 preludes and fugues. He also wrote the Goldberg Variations and the Brandenburg Concertos, which we're studying. The Brandenburg Concertos consist of 6 concerto grossi, and it's named Brandenburg after the Margrave of Brandenburg, who was a nobleman in that part of Germany. and he patronized Bach. What that means is he was his patron. He commissioned Bach to write some music for him. And this was a common thing in the Baroque era. Now, it's probable that Bach was never actually paid for his Brandenburg concertos. Rumour has it that he submitted them late, and the Margrave wasn't happy about this and wouldn't pay up. Our set work is Brandenburg Concerto number 5, and it's the third movement. There are 3 movements in each of those concertos, and we're just studying the third movement from the 5th concerto. Now, Concerto Grosso, as we've already mentioned, is a piece with a small group of soloists called the concertino and a larger group, which is the orchestra, and they're known as the ripieno. And this allows the composer to create different textures. Dialoguing is where you've got a kind of a speaking between parts. So the soloist would play a part, and then this would be followed by the rest of the orchestra. And this comes from in churches where you've got choirs separated by the altar, and then you'd get them kind of coming back and forth, one group singing and then the next group singing. Another word for this is antiphony. So remember that word, it's an important one.
Thank you.